In the 17th century, thousands were persecuted as witches across Europe and colonial America, and the fury of these witch hunts has left a permanent mark on our collective imagination. Today, the witch is mostly a stock character, an old woman dressed in rags and a pointed hat. But unsurprisingly, this character has little to do with the actual women who were caught up in these trials, the real people who lived and died and who got dressed in the morning. So today I want to show you what 3 very different women would have worn in the 17th century, to remind us all that these were real people, and to remind us all how cool 17th century fashion is. It is so cool and so underrepresented in the historical costuming community and in movies and TV. Everyone wants to dress up like Marie Antoinette, and no one wants to dress up like Elizabeth friggin' Bathory, so let's fix that. The 17th century could be called one of the bleakest centuries in history, and oddly, it's one of the least represented in popular culture. Inside Europe, the period was shaped by war, famine, and plague. Much of the rest of the world was afflicted by the violence of European colonial expansion and the growth of the transatlantic slave trade. It was a century rife with human suffering and the beginning of legacies of exploitation that we're still dealing with today. It was also the dawn of the Enlightenment. The Protestant Reformation of the previous century had been a catalyst for ongoing religious and social change. The spoils of colonial expansion were funding patronage of science and philosophy, and the chaos of war was creating opportunities for new political modes. So the 17th century was a time of new ideas, turmoil, and change. And one of the sites of these changes was ladies' underwear. Before we get into the outer dress of our various witches, we need to know what they were wearing underneath. The first layer was nothing new, a washable linen smock to absorb sweat and oils, and to protect the outer clothes from body stink. This was an absolute staple, as outer clothes were often made of wool or other materials that were not designed to be washed. The next layer is where we see some changes. In the previous century, this would have been a bodiced petticoat, a sleeveless underdress that doubled as low-key bust support. This garment was often red wool, as wool was the most widely available fiber, and red was considered to be a healthy color. This bodiced petticoat continued to be worn into the beginning of the 17th century. But as the century progressed, a more structured foundation garment became popular. The pair of bodies resembles later stays and corsets. It was stiffened with channels of whalebone or bundles of grass stalks called bends. This garment supported the bust and provided a smooth shape for clothes to sit on. It's worn here with a wool petticoat skirt. While I've called this underwear, this was really the 1600s equivalent of leggings and a t-shirt. The only thing these women are missing to be considered decent is a head covering of some sort and a partlet or a kerchief to cover the neckline. So, with our foundation sorted, let's get to the witchy stuff. On a March day in the rural county of Lancashire, local youth Alison Devis was walking down a country road. She crossed a peddler, and the two got into an argument when he refused to give her some pins. As the two parted ways, the peddler stumbled and fell, and was left with severe, lingering injuries. Alison was later tried for using witchcraft to cause the peddler's fall and illness. The case cascaded into a witch hunt and resulted in the trials and executions of 9 other local people for similar crimes, including 3 generations of Alison's own family. The majority of people convicted of witchcraft were poor, socially marginal women, and Alison was no exception. She came from a very poor family in rural England, and because of this, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what she would have worn. The garments of common people rarely survive to us. Cloth was expensive, so clothing would have been worn, patched, reworked into new clothing, and eventually sold as rags. Sometimes painting gives us clues, and there is a lot of continental painting from this period of common people, but English painting from this period mostly depicts the people who were paying the artists, or the wealthy elite. Thankfully, we have prints. Prints were much cheaper to produce than paintings, and thus allowed more popular, relatable subjects to be depicted in art. One popular set of prints was called the Cries of London. It depicted the various characters you might see around the streets of London trying to sell you their wares. There are many different iterations of the cries from different periods, and they can be a great source to see how common people dressed. I used an early 1600s edition of the cries to inform my look for Alison. For her structural garments, Alison would likely have been wearing that bodiced petticoat. Over top of this, she might have worn a linen partlet with a cool, ruffly collar. This era was the height of the popularity of the ruff, and even the poor were not spared from this trend. Her jacket is wool and has winged sleeves. It might have buttons or just pin closed in the front. Maybe why Alison was trying to get her hands on some pins that fateful day. For most occasions, she would have probably just worn her petticoat skirt, but if it was cold or she wanted to be a bit more put together, she'd wear a wool overskirt. Her clothing would have been second-hand, so really it could have been any color, and it was probably a bit patched and outdated. An apron would have been worn for most situations, and her clothes would have been leather-turned shoes with soft soles. To top it off, she wears a linen coif for both modesty and practicality, and a straw hat. When many people think of the backdrop of the witch hunts, well, they think of the Middle Ages, which is totally inaccurate. But when many slightly more historically literate people think of the witch hunts, they think of uptight Protestants. Overzealous Puritans and Presbyterians were the architects of the early modern witch hunts. And this is partly true. But when it comes to pure body count, it was Catholics that took home the win, and a small region in southwest Germany was the MVP. In 1627, the region that is today Germany was the theater of the 30 Years' War. A notoriously complicated conflict, it's sometimes described as a war of Catholics versus Protestants, but it could also be described as the Habsburg family takes on the world. In any case, Germany was absolutely devastated by the effects of the war. Not just the fighting, but the destruction, disease, and famine that came with it. With all this came a few clusters of the largest witch persecutions in history. One of these was the Bamberg witch trials, in which an estimated 900 people died over the course of 3 years. Along with the death toll, Bamberg is notable because several wealthy and high-status members of the community were killed, including the mayor and his wife, which means we get to look at some fancy clothes. There is a dearth of German art from this period, maybe because everyone was busy dying, so I've based this look off of images from nearby Flanders. Most wealthy people would have worn something a little bit like the dress of Alison Davis, just with a bit more zazz. It would have been a jacket and skirt topped off with a ruff, just with richer fabrics, a lacier ruff, and more boning in the bodice to create a very long waist, sometimes even swooping out a bit in the front. But in 1627, the year that the wife of the mayor of Bamberg was killed, a new silhouette began to emerge. And this new silhouette is the basis for our second witch's look. That ruff began to open up to a wide collar supported by wires, eventually just flopping over entirely in the 1630s. Poofy slashed sleeves became popular, tied in the center to create a double poof. The bodice still has long, rigid lines, but those lines are now interrupted by a belt tied just above the natural waist. This belt and the tie on the sleeves are both an element of the gown, an open, short-sleeved garment, often black silk that is worn over top of the jacket. Plain, rich silk satins were beginning to replace delicate brocades as the dominant fashionable textile. I think this period is really cool because you can really see the transition between two very different styles, from the rigid long waist and high ruff of the early 17th century to the curvier, satiny, Rubenesque look of the mid-17th century. Also in this period, many wealthy women stopped covering their heads, something that would have been shocking 100 years earlier and was still considered really distasteful by some. I have given this particular lady a hat complete with a big old ostrich feather, both because the cavalier hats women did wear in this period are very cool, and to save you from the horror of circa 1630 bangs. As the fires raged in Bamberg, English Puritans were beginning to settle in the New World. The Puritans were a strict branch of Protestant Christianity, and they were fleeing England to find a place where they could practice their religious beliefs free from the fear of persecution, and where they could persecute everyone else. They saw themselves as God's chosen, and everyone else was literally under the influence of satanic forces. When women in the colony were suspected of this diabolic collusion, they could be accused of witchcraft. But English women were not the only ones subject to suspicion. For the Puritans, the devil was present in everyday life. Anyone could fall prey to diabolic influence. It was known also that the devil had agents on earth, and fallen people who made a deal with him to alleviate their worldly suffering. To the Puritans, it was simply a given that indigenous people, by virtue of their heathen ways, were more or less under the influence of the devil. Additionally, this new land was seen as a gift from God. Those who resisted this new colony were clearly doing Satan's bidding. The Puritans aspired to Christianize their indigenous neighbors, and they viewed their triumphs in colonial warfare as divine acts of providence. Belief was a central pillar of the new Puritan colony, and it was central in its violence too. The witch hunts are sometimes called witch panics or witch crazes, and they're treated as anomalous instances of cruelty where everyone went mad, overwhelmed by some base Freudian instinct to kill old ladies, perhaps poisoned by hallucinogenic mold. But the horrifying truth of the witch hunts is that they were rational, procedural, and somewhat mundane. The trials were carried out by lawyers and judges, educated public servants doing their best to protect their communities from an evil that they truly, deeply believed in, the same kind of evil that was informing the colony's policies on the macro scale of colonial expansion. If we're to remember that the people who died in the witch hunts were real people, I think we have to remember that the people who killed them were real too. They were not violent mobs or mustache-twirling comic book villains. They were busybody neighbors and stuffy old men who really thought they were doing the good, responsible thing for their community. The Puritans practiced plainness of dress, a religious doctrine that forbade the wearing of bright colors and fancy or immodest clothes, especially if you weren't rich. The strictness of these doctrines began to wane by the end of the century, but it's safe to say that plain dress still had some impact on how people in New England dressed at the time of the witch trials. Otherwise, the colonists were probably dressed quite similarly to their counterparts in England. So I've turned again to the trusty Cries of London, this time to a 1688 edition which shows us a young Quaker woman. The Quakers were a totally different Protestant sect, but they too practiced plain dress in one way or another. So this London Quaker will be my guide for styling a New England Puritan. And honestly, she's dressed pretty similarly to every other young woman in this edition of the Cries, and I think that's the main takeaway. Most young, fashionable people with a bit of change in their pocket would aspire to their version of the fashionable styles, regardless of religious affinities, even as powerful as they were. She wears a black hood, a style that was really trendy in the middle of the century, but seems to have had some staying power. Her dress is up to date with short sleeves and an open neckline, though she chooses to cover up a bit with a linen kerchief, and this kerchief is the main thing that sets her apart from many of the other London women. Underneath, she's probably wearing a pair of bodies, though wealthier women in the period may have relied on their outer garments for structure, as the fashionable bodice of the period had a lot of boning in it. The dress has an attached skirt, and I've chosen to gather it up here in a bit of a bustle, as that was the look for people of all classes. I really like this touch because it shows that being fashionable, even then, wasn't just about having particular items, but rather it was about the way you styled yourself. The color for this garment might have been brown, gray, olive, maroon, or any other muted color in accordance with the Puritan doctrine of plain dress. Finally, she's got shoes with a heel, a departure from Alison Devis's softer and simpler turn shoes. The Salem witch trials are seared into our collective memory. It wasn't the biggest witch hunt of the early modern period, not by far, but it's one of the most remembered, and I think it's worth remembering. And I think a lot of things in the 17th century are worth remembering, so I hope you've enjoyed this horrifying little wander into this oft-ignored period, a period defined by cool fashions, colonialism, plague, complicated geopolitical conflicts, bold new ideas, climate chaos, and political divisiveness. Glad that's all behind us.